What is up, guys? I Crover Spilt Milk here today to discuss. It's been quite a good season in the Formula One in 2022. Uh, 2023 is just around the corner. I've got some thoughts going into 2023, and I want to share them with you today. I'm going to tell you who I think is going to be under pressure, what circuit will replace the Chinese Grand Prix, and a little discussion about the changes at the top of in Formula One, the various team principals, and the cabinet reshuffle there. So here we go. Going to discuss first who I think is going to be, which drivers I think are going to be under pressure this season. In number five, I'm going to say Nico Hulkenberg for Haas. Nico will be eager to show why he deserves to still be in Formula One, be seen as a more reliable set of hands compared to Schumacher, who he has replaced. Hulkenberg is seen as the ultimate midfield warrior, with Hulk's unenviable record of the most starts of no podium. This is exactly the driver Haas are looking for, someone who can score points on the days when the Haas is working well. Haas not in the position to grab podiums, although I'm sure that Hulk and Magnussen will be going for the podium places given half a chance. Why do I think Hulkenberg is under pressure? If a driver from a higher team falls from grace, for example, of Perez, and Verstappen can't work it out, and Perez has to go, Haas would certainly want to sign Perez, and Hulk or Magnussen definitely don't want to be the one showing the door to make way for Perez. Magnussen has had a good season for Haas last year. Not spectacular, but good, finishing fifth in Bahrain and the pole in Brazil. It's now down to Hulk to show why Haas should show Magnussen the door if the situation occurs. So basically, Nico Hulkenberg and Kevin Magnussen both have had seasons at Formula One. I'm sure that both would want to avoid that happening again. So they both want to show at Haas why they are the better driver, why they should be the one kept on. If a better driver comes available, why they should be paired with that driver, and so on. In fourth place, I'm going to go for Guan Yu Zhou at Alfa Romeo. Zhou has had a passable season with Alfa Romeo and was in no way completely trounced by teammate Bottas. However, Zhou only had a few decent results last season, which was the minimum expected of a rookie in the lower midfield team, although the Alpha was not the most reliable car last season, with both Zhou and Bottas getting 5 retirements each last season. Zhou just needs to show that year on year he has improved as a driver over 2023 to keep the seat again for 2024. I believe Zhou did do enough to give the team a good reason for them to keep him on for another season. In the background, let's not forget Alfa Romeo have 50 for Porsche waiting in the wings to take the seat. Bottas is firmly the team's number one driver, and the team will most likely discard Joe if they had to discard one if Porsche issued an ultimatum to their team to give him a seat. The second factor is Audi, who will control the Alfa Romeo Sauber team from 2026 onwards. I am sure but Bottas will be sticking around in the sport to be an incumbent driver to lead Audi's project, and I'm sure Joe would want to certainly give Audi a headache over driver choice and not make it an easy decision to drop him. I agree Joe deserves a second season in Formula One. Now he has to show why Audi should keep him on to partner Bottas, and it is not worth taking a chance on Porsche or any other driver for that matter at that point. The third driver most under pressure, I feel, is Yuki Tsunoda in the Alpha Tauri. If Yuki was surprised he was kept on for a second season at Alpha Tauri, I bet he'll be thanking his lucky stars getting a third season at Alpha Tauri for 2023. His mission this season is very simple. He must be incoming teammate Nick De Vries. No longer can Tsunoda hide behind Gasly and happily settle for being the second driver. Head of Red Bull Helmut Marko did say it'd be De Vries leading the team, citing Tsunoda as young and is not well seasoned compared to De Vries, with De Vries being F2 and Formula E champion, as well as being Mercedes reserve driver for a few seasons, gaining experience from a top team. But we all know how cutthroat Red Bull can be if they need to. And as I said in my end of season review, I think Sonoda retained the seat more by default and to keep continuity and be a benchmark for De Vries. However, De Vries is a good benchmark for Sonoda too. If Sonoda can beat an F2 and Formula E champion, then I believe that is reason enough for Tsunoda to remain in F1. Tsunoda had a good result of seventh at Imola in 2022, but he clashed with teammate Gasly at Silverstone when the team could have scored some good points, and then he also binned it in Canada. Tsunoda must cut out these mistakes and help the team get up the grid and out of ninth place. Let's not forget what Alpine said in 2021. AlphaTauri would have finished above Alpine if they had a second solid driver to complement Gasly. By the end of 2023, there must be a driver in the Red Bull Academy ready for Formula One in 2024. So Noda needs to show why he shouldn't be the one to make way. This is his third season at AlphaTauri, and if he doesn't have a good season this season, he can have no complaints if he ends up being dropped for 2024. In second place, quite an obvious one, Oscar Piastri driving for McLaren. There's a lot riding on McLaren at getting it right and signing Piastri. They had to pay off former race winner and high caliber driver Daniel Ricciardo, someone who perhaps was the highest rated driver, barring retiring Vettel, to not be on the grid for 2023. If Piastri does not do better than Ricciardo, which no offence to Ricciardo is not a very high bar, McLaren will end up with egg on their faces and the hole in their pocket after paying off Ricciardo and the cost of getting Piastri to McLaren. For Piastri, he has to be at least matching teammate Norris, or at least do enough to help McLaren get fourth place in the constructors for his first season. If Piastri is not touching distance of Norris, Piastri and McLaren may look a bit silly at the end of the season. So I think for me, Piastri has to be at least be in the wheel tracks of Norris for his first season. Of course, he want to beat Norris, but I think a reasonable goal for his rookie season would be to just be, at the same level as Norris, and at least helping the team get fourth place in the championship. So for me, the driver I feel is most under pressure for 2023. Bit of a left field choice here. Sergio Perez driving for Red Bull. This is the driver who I believe to be the most under pressure for next season, and certainly the most under pressure out of the top three teams. But hear me out why. Red Bull now has a ready insurance policy in Daniel Ricciardo being the third driver at Red Bull. If Perez steps out of line by not following orders or disrupts team harmony for any reason, or if he is not keeping up with Verstappen, it is important in 2023 and beyond that Perez is closer to Verstappen in qualifying and the race. It gives a team options, for example. Red Bull can split the strategy if Perez is right up there as a rear gunner to Verstappen. They can have one car on softs and the other on mediums. If Red Bull look out the front row and there isn't much to choose on strategy, which one was the fastest, Red Bull can hedge their bets either way. Again, Perez needs to be close to Verstappen to allow Red Bull more options rather than having to put Perez on a different strategy as he's out of position compared to Verstappen. For Ricciardo, he left the team not wanting to become number two to Verstappen, although I think the money Renault were offering helped Ricciardo make his mind to leave Red Bull. And I think Ricciardo may have regretted leaving Red Bull to roll the dice with Renault, hoping they would come up with the right car for the new regulations. And I think he certainly regretted moving to McLaren, bar the win in Italy. In addition, I don't think Red Bull have properly replaced Ricciardo since he left. Definitely Gasly and Albon were not ready so early on in their careers. And I think Perez is doing a good job, to be fair, to be Verstappen's wingman, and is doing the best job out of all his teammates and doing exactly what he was signed to do. Let's remember Perez was out of a drive before Red Bull picked him up. But with Mercedes and Ferrari expected to be closer to Red Bull next season, Perez needs to be closer to Verstappen. Mid 2022, Perez seemed to struggle and was left very much in the dust by Verstappen. And I think Perez should have finished second in the championship as Red Bull had head and shoulders the best car for the new regs. I doubt he'll get another chance at second in the championship. I believe Mercedes and Ferrari pairings, the drivers are much closer to each other compared to how close Verstappen and Perez are. I think that if it was Verstappen and Ricciardo, that would be another close driver pairing where both drivers would have a shot at the championship should the car prove to be the cream of the crop. I believe Red Bull only had a few perfect weekends in 2022. That is 1-2 finishes with the fastest lap, meaning the team scores maximum points at that event. What Red Bull want is Perez in second and is far ahead of third place to provide the option of putting him on some new tyres to go for the fastest lap if Verstappen hasn't already claimed the fastest lap. So that way the extra point is taken away from a rival. All points count, and the extra point may make all the difference later on in the season. I mean, Perez himself, he finished 3 points behind Leclerc in the championship. If Perez got four more fastest lap, for example, Perez would have scraped second in the championship and secure a clean sweep in the championship for Red Bull. Could Ricardo have got second place in the championship in the Red Bull last season? Quite possibly. So that's the reasons why I think those five drivers are very much under pressure for 2023. Now let's move on to China. Let's talk about China. I don't want to sound like Donald Trump, but China. Let's talk about China and the Chinese Grand Prix. Um, what race should replace the Chinese Grand Prix, if any? The Chinese Grand Prix was scheduled for the 16th of April, 2 weeks after the Australian Grand Prix and 2 weeks before the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. Here are my five top options. I know, I never count down. Well, it is almost New Year after all. So I will say this a lot for the upcoming circuits. I think the entry slot is a great opportunity for a one-off Grand Prix at a circuit that's not usually on the calendar to be a trial, to be assessed, perhaps to be a full time on the calendar later on. If fans flock to the circuit, if the drivers like the circuit, etc., if the one-off event goes well, it could find its way on the calendar permanently, like what has happened to Emilia Romagna Grand Prix at Imola, and this is certainly going to be them and this is certainly going to be, something that we want to consider when considering the options as, perhaps a circuit that could go on the circuit full time. So, the fifth most likely thing they'll do is host another Grand Prix in Australia, and to a lesser extent, perhaps another circuit in Australasia. Although I'm not sure of any other circuits in Australasia outside of Australia. There could be one in New Zealand, or an impromptu street circuit could be organised on one of the islands in the South Pacific. Let me know in the comments if there's any other circuits on the continent. It's a very unlikely choice that this will happen. That there'll be a second race, in Australia or Australasia. But this will tie in nicely with the sustainability buzzword everyone likes to use these days. That's another word we're going to be using a lot in this countdown. Sustainability. There are lots of circuits in Australia that can be used, or we could even have a double header at Albert Park, and the title could be the Victorian Grand Prix after the Australian the circuit is in. It does sound a bit strange. The Victorian Grand Prix sounds like um, there's going to be lots of old cars, and the Ford Model One racing at the circuit, and who knows. You could say the same with Azerbaijan and having a double header there, but street circuits take a lot of planning and cooperating to pull it off. I'm sure the local Baku government would only tolerate a weekend closing the roads, never mind closing them for a week to accommodate a double header event. I think it's unlikely we'll see a double header event again in Formula One, unless we have a similar situation like we had in 2020, and they do it to ensure enough events are run so a full championship can be achieved. There are other circuits in Australia, like Adelaide, the home of the first Australian Grand Prix in the modern era, which last hosted the Grand Prix in 1995. Um, and boy, I'm sure everyone remembers what happened in 1995, the classic incident between Michael Schumacher and Damon Hill in 1994, when Schumacher's Benetton went up and over Hill's Williams, eliminating Schumacher on the spot and damaging Hill's suspension, so he had to retire too, which handed Schumacher the championship. It could be called the South Australian Grand Prix after the Australian state that Adelaide is in. There are other circuits in Australia that there is time for them to be brought up to F1 standard, like the Phillip Island circuit. So these other circuits could be, there's time now between now and April where we could bring the circuit up to standard. Do things. So the Phillip Island circuit, which is also in Victoria, it could also be titled the Victorian Grand Prix. This track usually hosts the motorbike and supercar events, but it did host the what I call the prehistoric Australian Grand Prix. Before 1950s, it hosted the Australian Grand Prix from 1928 to 1935. Before modern day F1 in the 1950s. So it has hosted Australian Grand Prix before, but in a very different era. While coming on to about 100 years ago now. It's crazy to think. In fourth place, I'm going to bundle a lot here in this entry, but we could resurrect the Southeast Asian Grand Prix, again tapping into making Formula One sustainable and a good stopping point between Australia and Azerbaijan. I'm thinking of circuits like the Bud Circuit in India and the Korea International Circuit in South Korea, which both hosted the last Grand Prix in 2013. There's also Sepang in Malaysia, which last hosted in 2017. Perhaps the second race in Japan could also be tabled and would fit in nicely. Not necessarily hosting at Suzuka. There are lots of other circuits in Japan, for example, like the Fuji Speedway and the Okayama International Circuit, which was formerly known as the TI Circuit, among others. You may remember the specific Grand Prix in the TI Circuit. There's loads of other circuits in Japan as well, and the race could be named after the Japanese prefecture they are located in, or just call it the Pacific Grand Prix like we did before. The main reasoning for resurrecting an old race again is sustainability, as this race could be twinned with the Australian Grand Prix in the future, and as a stop off when this F1 circus travels back to Europe or makes its way back to Europe, or could be bundled in with the Japanese and Singaporean Grand Prix as well as maybe bundled in with the Chinese Grand Prix once China's back on its feet. Thinking more long term, a race in Southeast Asia could be hosted between the Chinese and Australian Grand Prix. That makes logical sense. I think this is a great opportunity for F1 to tap into the Indian, Korean, and Malaysian markets and see if since the Liberty takeover of F1, will Southeast Asian fans flock back to Formula One? I think it's a great idea. I think that would be makes sense. So why not try it and give it a go? Another, a race in Southeast Asia. It doesn't have to be. I just mentioned India, South Korea, and Malaysia as examples. Couldn't think of any others, but I'm sure there's other tracks in Southeast Asia that could play host. In number three, I'm going to say the Portimao circuit in Portugal. I get the feeling this is probably the most likely outcome, as Portimao stood in 2020 and 2021, and why not again in 2023 after a year hiatus? But out of all five options, I will suggest this is perhaps the least sustainable and logical choice, but perhaps a choice the FIA will most likely go for, seeing as you would go long haul to Portugal after Australia and then significantly back on yourself back to Azerbaijan. But then again, we have the nightmare of the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, and then we go to Miami, and then we go back to Europe for Emilia Romagna. So I think sometimes Formula One can be a bit hypocritical. Um, s- Sometimes having the European part of the season and then have flying off for one Grand Prix somewhere in the world. I'm looking at you, Miami and Canada. Perhaps if you twin these two together, it would make sense. Looking at the 2023 calendar, it is mostly logical. We kick off the season in the Middle East with Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and then off to Australia, and then we plan to stop in China before coming back to Azerbaijan and kick off the European part of the season. And then we're off to the far. Then after the European season's finished, we then go off to the Far East with Singapore and Japan. And then there's a questionable placing of Qatar. Perhaps Qatar should be placed at the beginning of the season, or perhaps be twinned with Abu Dhabi as the penultimate race. That will make sense and be sustainable and logical. And then after Qatar, we then off to the Americas, finishing off in the Middle East with the Grand Prix at Abu Dhabi. An almost perfect and logical calendar we have, but a few improvements would be to put Miami and Canadian Grand Prix together as perhaps as a flyaway during the European season, or perhaps move them to the end of the season with the other races in the Americas. The other improvement would be to remove Qatar to the beginning of the season with the other Middle East races. It'll always be a struggle to find a good fit for the Australian Grand Prix in a sustainable way, but perhaps it could be nicely be joined up with Singapore, Japan, and a resurrected Southeast Asian Grand Prix. But let's go back to Portimao, and it could be argued that it could be used to start the European part of the season one race earlier, albeit we go from Australia to Western Europe, then to Eastern Europe, and then to America before coming back to Central Europe for the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. The race promoter in Portugal is very keen to bring the F1 back to the Algarve, according to Motorsport Weekly. So I think this is probably the most the option that the FAL will go for even though it's probably the least sustainable and the least logical. But there you go. Um, the second best option I would pick is Kyalami in South Africa. It is no secret that F1 has been keen to host races in Africa, and Kyalami in South Africa is the most likely candidate to pioneer this endeavour. Again, this one-off event in Kyalami would be an excellent gauge for everyone to see if a Grand Prix in Kyalami, and by extension Africa, would be a hit 30 years after it last hosted a Grand Prix. Yes, I know, 30 years without a Grand Prix in Africa. I remember in my Grand Prix guide for 1997, they do, at the end of the year, they release a yearbook. The South African Grand Prix was on the calendar for 1998, but didn't go ahead. A race in South Africa would perhaps be best placed between Australia and Europe as we head back to the Western Hemisphere towards Europe. So it would make sense if it took China's place on the calendar for this time. And, perhaps would make sense, to host it full time after Australia as we head back to Europe if we do go that way. It was rumoured Kyle Lamy will replace the Belgian Grand Prix for 2023, and it might still do so for 2024 onwards as F1 looks to bring F1 to everywhere in the world. But of course, sacrifices will have to be made, and other circuits will have to come off the calendar to make room for these new places. I think the way I've been going, you'll know who's going to be number one. But I'm first quickly a list of honourable mentions. Perhaps have a race in Germany at either Hockenheim, Nürburgring or Hockenheim will be more logical and sustainable compared to Portugal. And I find it mad that with Mercedes, the Schumacher legacy, Vettel, etc., we don't have a German Grand Prix. But with the demise of of Schumacher, of Vettel, and of Mercedes in 2022, perhaps the case for hosting a Grand Prix in Germany isn't as strong as it was. There could also be the Sakir Grand Prix from 2020 that could make a comeback using a shortened version of the Bahrain Grand Prix, but this is highly unlikely as this was used to bring up the number of races in 2020. Perhaps a second race at Abu Dhabi maybe? Unlikely, as Abu Dhabi would want the prestige of being the last Grand Prix of the season, but it could be interesting to have a race at both ends of the season and then have a direct comparison could be made, as to how the teams and drivers have progressed or perhaps regressed during the season. Maybe a second Grand Prix at Hungaroring, perhaps not. Okay, I've stalled enough now. So number one will be, as you probably can guess, Istanbul Park in Turkey. It's the most logical solution and would complement the Azerbaijan Grand Prix nicely. Like Portimao, it last hosted as a standing Grand Prix in 2020 and 2021. However, I'm sure like Portimao, Istanbul Park would like to build on this and make the Turkish Grand Prix a mainstay on the calendar. Unlike Kyalami, though, and circuits in Southeast Asia, a race at Turkey would only be a short-term, temporary thing. Having a trial run at Kyalami or Southeast Asia or another Australian or Japanese circuit would have more value in helping circuit organisers and the FIA gauge whether having the race permanently on the calendar would work out or not. So perhaps try a different circuit and then as a trial, if it works out, why not add it to the calendar like with Emilia Romagna? I get the feeling the FIA are not interested in hosting in Portugal or Turkey. Otherwise, I'm sure they would have been kept on for 2022 and beyond. In conclusion, I believe Portimao and Istanbul Park are the most likely candidates, and the FIA will choose from. With Kyalami in with an outside chance and great opportunity to have a trial run at Kyalami, and then having the data to decide whether it be South Africa or Belgium on for future calendars would also be a great opportunity to look at other circuits in the Southeast Asian and Australasian regions. And so, I'm going to end up on talking about the mad situation with the management in Formula One, with the teams. It has also been a silly season for team principals. It's like the F1 driver market. One change is made, and there's a domino effect. Well, it all kicked off with Binotto getting sacked from Ferrari, and then Alfa Romeo's Vasseur will now replace Binotto, and then McLaren's Seidel taking Vasseurs' place at Alfa Romeo in anticipation for heading up the Audi project and ensuring Team Audi is ready to compete for honours in 2026. This gives Seidel 3 years to prepare from now and plenty of time to evaluate the progress of drivers and who side will pick to pilot the Audis. Zhou and Bottas hope to state their cases to be kept on as incumbents, and other drivers like Antonio Giovinazzi, Mick Schumacher, Daniel Ricciardo, and Theo Pourchaire are keen to make their cases too. The odd one out from this merry-go-round is Williams, with senior members leaving of their own accord. I think the Williams team have made progress in 2022, and if they had Albon and De Vries driving for them in 2022, I'm sure the results would be better, and Williams would have had a good chance of matching or even beating the 2021 tally. This mostly came from George Russell's very fortunate second place at Belgium. I'm really disappointed that if it was results that led to Capito leaving and everyone else, um, it should be taken in context that this was like a rare freak result. Should be taken with a pinch of salt. I'm sure the upcoming weeks and months all will be revealed with the team principles of to what's happening. Well, that's it from me this time, and this will be my last F1 video of 2022, unless something absolutely outrageous does happen between now and 2023. Who do you think is under pressure for Which driver do you think is under pressure for 2023? Which circuit should replace the Chinese Grand Prix? And what do you think will happen next in the F1 management shakeup? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in 2023.